estamos trabajando en una reforma integral del sistema de propiedad intelectual. Una reforma que busca generar acceso de la población a la cultura, a la educación, al conocimiento. En ese sentido, quisiera ver qué recomendaciones puede dar a los gobiernos en Latinoamérica, que estamos buscando una transformación del sistema de propiedad intelectual en general para generar acceso y tener un sistema equilibrado en nuestro sistema legislativo.
So thanks for the question. I think Latin America has already taken an important lead. When we launched Creative Commons, one of the first people we went to speak to was Gilberto Gil in Brazil. And Gil then became the culture minister of Brazil, and as culture minister got Brazil to begin to push for changes not just in copyright policy, but also in patent policy, which of course is another nightmare of misregulation. And that progress is spreading to other parts of Latin America. I was honored today to be able to meet the mayor of Argentina, mayor of Buenos Aires. Maybe he wants to be the mayor of Argentina. I don't know. I didn't ask.
Yes, he wants.
And he was proud to be able to announce that all of the city government works were to be released today under Creative Commons licenses. And they committed to an open data project with Code for America to make government data increasingly accessible, to facilitate the kind of skeptical look at what the government does that's necessary to build trust inside the political system. Now, in America, the United States, government data is already free. The law makes it free. So when, for example, Barack Obama puts on his webpage a Creative Commons license, which he did, I mean, of course, we like it, but it doesn't really mean much because it's already free. But when the mayor of Buenos Aires does that, it's significant because it's not free automatically. It's not by law in the public domain. It's an affirmative act which takes work that otherwise would be controllable and makes it uncontrollable. So I think the thing to do is to get other countries to build on these local examples. There's no leadership from the United States on how to find rational IP policy. It's got to be built around the world and then come back to the United States and embarrass the United States into doing the right thing. So if there are 5 more countries in Latin America who followed these examples of Argentina and Brazil, we might have progress to begin to do something more sensibly globally.
Lucía.
Buenas tardes, profesor. Primero decirle que nos reconforta el corazón poder escuchar su lucha y sus conceptos. Me llamo Lucía Pelaya, soy presidente de la Subcomisión de Propiedad Intelectual de la Asociación de Bibliotecarios Graduados de la República Argentina y nosotros estamos llevando a cabo una lucha incansable, pero sin obtener nada a favor. Nosotros hace 4 años ingresamos al Congreso de la Nación un proyecto para modificar la ley de derechos de autor, porque nuestra ley argentina es altamente proteccionista, no tiene ningún tipo de excepciones para educación ni para bibliotecas, y no conseguimos nada. Ya los 2 primeros años cayó el Estado parlamentario, y ahora en febrero del 2014 caería de nuevo. Y no sé, no le puedo pedir una fórmula mágica, pero no sé, tenerlo ahí tengo que preguntarle cómo se puede impactar frente al legislador. Bueno, ya vimos cuando usted habló de corrupción que el tema del dinero que financia las campañas ata sus votos frente a los proyectos. Pero para nosotros es terrible, y si pensamos en la Directiva Europea de Canon al Préstamo, es la destrucción de la biblioteca. Y cuando hablamos de remix y derechos digitales, vemos que las bibliotecas ni siquiera en lo más básico pueden garantizar el acceso a la información.
Yeah, so when Aaron Swartz decided to take up the fight against what became known as SOPA and PIPA, he came to me and he said this is what he was going to do. And I told him he was wasting his time. I said, there's no way you're going to beat them. They have all the money in the world, they're the most effective lobbying group in the world, and there's just no way to beat them. And I said, that's why you should be working with me on the project you got me to work on, corruption, because until we fix that, you won't win. And he proved to me I was wrong. Because what they did, not just Aaron, of course, but scores of people initially and then tens of thousands of people, by the end, they mobilized a community, an internet community, to appear out of nowhere and to destroy the most powerful lobbying organization in America. Hollywood had never been stopped before. Never once were they stopped. That was the first time. And 2 days before they were stopped, if you had asked any senator in the United States Senate, none of them would have said it was possible. Chris Dodd, who was the former senator from Connecticut, and when he was a senator, he promised never to become a lobbyist when he left Congress. And he didn't become a lobbyist, he became the head of the Motion Picture Association of America. He had the signed promise from 60 senators to support the SOPA-PIPA legislation. The signed promise from his friends. And they flipped. And they flipped merely because people, ordinary people, focused on this and started calling their representative and forcing their representative to change their mind. Now, I can't believe this is only possible in the United States. I can't believe it because I've seen the same thing in Europe. Europe has been extremely successful in fighting crazy patent regulation and very powerful against the fight against ACTA. And I think what we see is this opportunity for using the net to bring together especially younger people who know and understand what the internet's about, and to begin to use them to protest in a way that the lobbyists and the political people just can't resist. So it's not for me to tell you how to deal with reform of government in Argentina. I don't know enough. But I can say that what was an impossible task in America turned out to be possible because people could be motivated in the way Aaron was able to motivate them. And I think the same thing should be able to happen across Latin America too.
Una pregunta aquí. Y hay otra en el fondo.
Buenas. Buenas noches, mi nombre es Mauricio Álvarez, soy colombiano, abogado e investigador y vinculado a Flaxo como estudiante. Quisiera poder como concretar en el escenario internacional, dentro de las actividades que hay que plantear en las agendas gubernamentales en materia legislativa, si esta iniciativa también vincularía llegar a la OMPI con los tratados del TODA y el TOIER, que tienen que ver con la parte de derechos de autor en Internet, y de qué forma ante la OMPI, qué tipo de puentes se trazarían para contar con una influencia en ese tipo de tratados que involucran los derechos de autor en la parte de las tecnologías. ¿Qué iniciativas se podrían trazar a través de ese objetivo?
Yeah, so I don't think it's realistic to imagine, protests that are arguing for the fair use right, or protests that are arguing about a modification to a compulsory licensing right. And I don't think you're going to have protests at the level of very specific changes in copyright. But you can have protests that force the government to recognize that the system needs to be updated, needs to be changed. So my view is copyright is an essential part of a creative culture. And my criticism is not with the idea of copyright. My criticism is with the idea of 19th and 20th century copyright being applied to 21st century technologies. And the response to that criticism is not to abolish copyright, it's to remake it, to make it make sense in a digital age. And what the protest can do is to increasingly force the recognition that we need a fundamental reconsideration of the way copyright law functions. Now, many, especially older copyright scholars, are terrified or just so frustrated with that way of talking because it's kind of the ironic history of copyright that for literally 100 years, copyright law has been trying to globalize, to create one regime for the whole world. The Berne Convention originally launched that aspiration. It was finally realized in 1995 with the adoption of international treaties and the United States signing on in a way in the TRIPS agreement to essentially create what was basically the same regime internationally. But the regime makes no sense for the digital age. So they've spent 100 years getting a new regime for the world. It just turned out that it's the regime that made sense 100 years ago, not the regime that makes sense today. So older copyright scholars and older copyright lawyers are just so exhausted by that fight. They don't even want to begin to think about a new process of thinking through what the architecture for copyright should look like. But that's the opening for younger scholars, for younger lawyers, for people who understand the technology to say, yes, we need a new way of thinking about copyright. Now, WIPO, I think, is potentially receptive to this. When I first went to WIPO, I was told by an assistant to the Director General that I was the devil and that I was not permitted to stay beyond the hour that they had allowed me to enter the place. But a year and a half or 2 years ago, I was invited to come back to WIPO and speak, and in a full convention of WIPO, allowed to say everything that the devil thinks, and the building didn't burn down. They were surprised at this fact. But I think that reflected the way that WIPO itself is recognizing that an update to copyright is necessary. And in the United States, increasingly you have people on the right and the left who are recognizing that copyright law needs to be updated. And on Capitol Hill, there was a memorial service for Aaron Swartz. And of course, the traditional liberal Democrat senators and representatives showed up. But some of the most powerful Republicans showed up as well. Darrell Issa, who's a right-wing crazy. Don't tell him I said that, but a right-wing crazy. But he is the one person who stood up and criticized copyright law, a right-wing Republican criticizing copyright law for the extremism of copyright law. This is signaling there's a sea change in opportunity here. And that's what we need to be pushing for the commission that sits down and thinks about what a copyright law for the 21st century should look like. And I hope it doesn't take a century to pass it, but it'll take 5 years or 10 years to get something like that defined. But that's the thing we should be aiming for. And every time some crazy new SOPA PIPA legislation gets raised, we should be on the streets saying not one more bit of this insanity until we start the process of figuring out what a new regime should look like.
I would like to also congratulate you for the presentation, but I'm more optimistic. You have celebrated one victory, which was stopping SOPA, but we just approved a treaty on exceptions, mandatory exception that was unthinkable 10 years ago. So now we see that it's a path in WIPO, as the gentleman asked it, and we have an affirmative agenda, and activists and government like Ecuador who are leading the treaty on exceptions. We really would like to see Creative Commons supporting these affirmative rights on exceptions. What do you think, and what do you have to say to the community to join those governments pushing for mandatory exceptions internationally?
So as many of you know, the community came together this week in a very dramatic way. We expected about 60 people to show up, and 100 people showed up for a conversation about a policy that they wanted Creative Commons to adopt, a policy which encouraged local representatives to participate in the conversation about copyright reform. Now, from one perspective, it would be incredibly hypocritical if Creative Commons said no, right? Because I have something to do with Creative Commons, and I've said one or two things about copyright reform. So if the people like me are not permitted, then why shouldn't everybody be permitted? And the answer is, I think all of us encourage the idea of people participating in that debate and not shying away from the debate because they happen to be affiliated with us. The organization that we run, Creative Commons, is limited by the law in the extent to which it can be lobbying for changes. which is why the organization is very careful about not engaging in lobbying activities because it would risk the legal status of the organization. But the organization is different from its members, and its members wear many different hats, and what we hope is that we're at the right stage to begin to have this affirmative conversation about the right ways to begin to push copyright law. So the treaty on exceptions is a very important part of the story. What's happening with the right to remix in Germany is another part of that story. That's an affirmative desire for a new kind of exception to be placed into the architecture of copyright law. That's the beginning of exactly, I agree, the victory that I think we can have. And remember I said, I left this movement 6 years ago, and since I left, all the victories have been won, which means I should have left much longer ago than 6 years, but I am optimistic that this has sparked something. In an audience like this, it's kind of astonishing. An audience like this gets together to talk about copyright law. 10 years ago, the chance that would have happened was zero, exactly zero. But that's not because of me, it's because the movement has now connected with people around the world and they recognize its importance. Right there.
Hi, my name's Alex Galarza, and I'm a doctoral student that's doing dissertation research here in Argentina. And I wanted to ask you about the academic side of your activities. How we make more remixable knowledge as academics within our structures of promotion and tenure. So my own professional organization, the American Historical Association, just recommended that I embargo my dissertation for 6 years to protect that knowledge until it's publishable in a monograph so I can get my ticket to tenure, right? So the contradiction is that I come from a public institution, Michigan State. I'm here on a Fulbright, and there's a great contradiction there in my activities being funded by the public, yet that knowledge being then gated in a certain way. So in short, as academics, how do we make more remixable knowledge while also being realistic about how our publishing system works, how our promotion system works, and how our tenure system works?
Right. It's a great question. So I'm a very strong believer that academics have a moral obligation to make their work universally accessible. I was at a conference in Sweden that was organized by a collecting rights society, and some academic stood up and he talked about how much he liked to receive his annual check from the collecting society, which was about 20 euros or something like that. That was collected every time people Xeroxed his articles around the world. All added up to 20 euros, and he said he enjoyed it because he could buy whatever, 20 euros. And I stood up and I said, it's okay for rich countries to tax themselves in this kind of crazy way to get access to knowledge, because they'll get access to the knowledge. But any system of taxing to access this knowledge basically guarantees that all of the developing world has no legal access to this knowledge. And how can you as an academic endorse a system that produces that result? We are from the Enlightenment. Universal knowledge, spread globally, that's our mission. And we should be pushing wherever it's feasible to achieve exactly that mission. Now, that begs the question of who should be pushing. I don't believe people should be sacrificing their career. When there are people who already have a guaranteed career who should be leading the fight, like people with tenure, people with jobs, especially jobs at great institutions. And those people can be shamed into doing the right thing by students. It's the most obvious organizational technique for students to begin to sit in professors' offices. Just sit in and say, explain to me why you published this article in a journal that makes it so 3/4 of the world's population will never have access to it. Now, legal articles, who cares, right? Law review articles in the Harvard Law Review, whatever. But it's, medical articles about malaria get published and can't be read in the only countries where there is malaria. It's completely insane. And yet the only way we're going to get to a change is if people begin to organize and force people to explain themselves. Justify your decision to support a journal that blocks access in the rest of the world. Yeah, now, Aaron's demise was because he was so furious about this fact. And what he did in the last months of before he was arrested was begin to go around to universities and tell people, you have a moral obligation to take the access to information you have and access the information and make it accessible around the world. And we don't know what he was really doing, or the world doesn't know what he was really doing by downloading all the articles from JSTOR. But one suspects what he was doing was trying to envision a way to make that academic knowledge accessible to the rest of the world. And the tragedy is that, in fact, political pressure on JSTOR and other such organizations will produce them changing their policies to make it accessible to the rest of the world. So here is where students can do an enormous amount of good. And it's kind of fun to occupy a professor's office or to occupy the administration and to sit down and just refuse to move until it's explained. Because it needs to be explained. Now you say, we have to support, traditional or reasonable systems like publishing. We do. But the question is, what is the reasonable system in the 21st century? There are open access journals that have peer review systems like Public Library of Science. They produce great academic work, but they commit every bit of their work to the public by guaranteeing using a CC BY license that everybody can have access to it forever for free. We just need to change the way in which we make academic work available. And we can do that. It's been shown and demonstrated, and we can do it in a way that gives knowledge and spreads access to knowledge. But the only way we'll do it is if we pressure the people who make that decision. And the people who make that decision, thanks to the copyright system, are the authors of these works. And those people are complete pushovers. They're complete pushovers. Professors, I don't mean to insult anybody here, but professors are wimps when it comes to people criticizing them. And so if you criticize them for their moral choice here, they will think about it. And I think they'll make the right choice. So that's our obligation, to put that pressure. And you're asking the right questions and you push it in your own way, but I don't expect you to carry the burden until you have tenure at a great institution, whether here or back in the United States.
Bueno, tenemos 5 preguntas con la que veo aquí, 6. Y creo que con eso vamos a cerrar porque se va a hacer demasiado tiempo. El micrófono está en el fondo.
Hola, buenas noches. Mi nombre es John Piñango y represento a Creative Commons Venezuela. Yo quisiera hacer esta pregunta, ¿no? El gobierno venezolano tiene intenciones de intensificar su política de acceso abierto y de las 6 licencias que ofrece Creative Commons, digamos, el Estado venezolano promueve el uso en sus productos de solo una de ellas, que es Buy, No Commercial, Share Alike. Pero yo quisiera preguntar, si entramos en temas de Open Data y Open Government, ¿cuál es la sugerencia de usted en relación a utilizar la licencia CC de dominio público o la de reconocimiento y por qué?
So my view is government should be using the freest license if they're using a license at all. We also have a tool to essentially commit something to the public domain. I would much rather they use that. But in countries where this work is copyrightable, where data is copyrightable, then I think they should be using the freest license. But I think the way to get them there is to take advantage of their first important step. To say, what you've done is extremely important by adopting Creative Commons licenses. You've signaled your understanding of the importance of access to knowledge. And you've helped in all sorts of ways. But once you identify what they've done that's right and good, then you begin to ask questions. Again, the way Aaron would ask questions. Okay, this is great, but you see the way it's making it so commercial businesses can't actually take advantage of this government data in a way that happens in countries like the United States with weather data. And so you begin to force through these questions them to recognize that if they're really committed to the policy, they need to be more permissive. Now we have a great example of this in the context of open access to education or educational resources. This is one of the areas we pushed very strongly early on in the history of Creative Commons, and recently has become a key focus. Our CEO, when she worked at Hewlett, was keenly focused on open access to education, and Cable Green, who's sitting right next to you right here, has been a tireless advocate around the world to get people to push for the right direction in access to educational materials. But when educators first adopted Creative Commons licenses, they were adopting the most restrictive license. And then that same dialogue happened, where people would say, that's great, it's great to adopt the Creative Commons license, but why would you need a non-commercial, no-derivative license? Why wouldn't you just need an attribution license? So why don't we take what you've done and make it a little bit better? And there's been a slow migration, or at least slow from my perspective, but there has been a migration towards freer licenses. And I think that's the dynamic. Bring them into the tent and then get them to the table you want them to be sitting at.
Larry, you mentioned in your presentation that the Creative Commons licenses are at 4.0 and in some ways indicate some possible directions for copyright reform to go in, but that the Creative Commons technology is at, say, 1.1 level. Can you describe some of the enhancements you'd like to see to the Creative Commons technology that would bring it up to a 4.0 level, and perhaps draw upon some technologies that have moved well beyond 1.0 to illustrate the examples?
No. I have a patent for the ideas, and it's not yet cleared. So, yeah, I mean, vaguely or simply, but I think the best way to think about it is, the early adopters of Creative Commons kind of like the idea that they would have to go edit their web page by adding metadata, RDF data, to express their Creative Commons license. It kind of showed the world that they were geek cool, right? You could edit your web page to add the Creative Commons license. And then there are certain people, certain sites like Flickr that made it so you could begin to pick those things in an express way. But this was for the early adopters, for the people really committed. The technology is only going to work in the way it needs to work, is when it's completely invisible to the user. Like the user makes a choice, but then content gets marked in a way that's reliably searchable and identifiable and can be validated across all sorts of platforms. And we at Creative Commons are going to have to address a very fundamental policy question about that. Because the norm as it's developed in companies like Facebook, for example, is that you have to give people the option to opt out. So if you have a Facebook account and you decide you want to shut off your Facebook account, Facebook is required in some countries, but it's their policy universally, to allow you to erase everything you've ever done in Facebook. It creates a problem for Creative Commons. Because if you've CC licensed your stuff in Facebook, by definition, that means it's available forever anywhere. And so how those two communities can coexist is going to be a hard policy question, but I think it could be enabled by better technology that makes these choices invisibly and under the surface in a way that makes it so people can participate easily and get what they want because they're participating, but making the system much more efficient. Now, I don't criticize CC much for this, because it was hard 5 and 10 years ago to figure out this problem. And it's kind of lucky we didn't really work hard on solving that particular problem 5 or 10 years ago, because if we had, what we would have built would not work in the architecture of the internet as it is right now. I think we're at a stage where we can see what it looks like, what the answer looks like, and we just need to make a commitment to now building out in this way that takes advantage of the architecture and begins to deliver real value in reliably accessing content is legitimately licensed freely. And we'll do it. I'm sure we'll do it. We've got the right people, and we've got people around the world participating in it. It's got to become our commitment.
Hola. Al comienzo de la presentación hablabas de la necesidad de modificar las leyes en el sentido de regular la cultura donde corresponde. Y vimos un par de ejemplos donde claramente la regulación no es útil, incluso genera casos de censura. ¿En qué casos crees vos que es necesaria o beneficiosa una regulación?
Yeah, so when I use this general phrase, we need to deregulate culture, my liberal friends, I'm a liberal, but my liberal friends don't like it because in America we liberals like to talk about the need to regulate, and it's the conservatives who like to talk about the need to deregulate. And I just like to mix it up. I'd like to be a liberal who speaks in a conservative way. So I like to be a liberal who says we need to deregulate because it makes conservatives think about it differently. But it's a slogan, right? When you get down to the particulars, of course, it's necessary to regulate in all sorts of ways to protect freedom as well as to restrict freedom. So you need civil rights laws that give you the ability to sue liberation music when they abuse their rights, if you're going to protect the freedom of people to practice their fair use rights. And the DMCA gives me that law. So that's a regulation of liberation music. It's a good regulation of liberation music. I'm for it. So I don't mean to confuse it by using such a simple slogan. I just mean to motivate people to think about it who might not necessarily start where I start, but I want to bring them to a place where they can think about it. It's for Darrell Issa, it's my only favor for Darrell Issa.
Eduardo.
Sí, buenas noches. Mi nombre es Eduardo Bertoni, soy profesor de Derecho en esta facultad. Y quería, primero agradecerle por la profunda y muy emotiva presentación. Pero quería volver a la discusión sobre el rol de la academia y un poco más precisamente el rol de las facultades de Derecho y un poco más precisamente el rol de la educación en las facultades de Derecho sobre los temas vinculados a derecho a autor y propiedad intelectual. Porque me parece que eso forma parte también de la estrategia de cambio que se está proponiendo. Usted hablaba en algún momento de los jóvenes abogados, yo hablaría de los estudiantes de Derecho, que de acuerdo a mi experiencia, la formación en lo que tiene que ver con propiedad intelectual y derechos de autor es sesgada respecto a una visión que es la visión que produce las cuestiones negativas a la cultura que usted ha señalado. La primera pregunta, que tal vez es un poco retórica porque intuyo claro la respuesta, es si usted no cree que tendríamos que, desde el rol de la educación en derecho, reexaminar los programas en donde se está enseñando propiedad intelectual y derechos de autor, porque la consecuencia, si no, es tener jóvenes abogados que después trabajan derecho de autor y propiedad intelectual para firmas de abogados que protegen derechos y que producen artículos académicos que son los que leen los jueces y los tribunales y que después deciden en contra de lo que nosotros estamos hablando aquí. Entonces, me parece que esto debe ser parte de la estrategia. Y la segunda pregunta, que ya no es retórica, porque la primera entiendo para dónde iría la respuesta, es ¿cuál es la situación, por ejemplo, en los Estados Unidos? Si un estudiante está en Harvard, puede ir al Berkman Center y escuchar cosas diferentes, o si está en Stanford, puede ir al Center for Technology and Society y escuchar cosas diferentes. Pero ¿cuánto de esto hay en el resto de las escuelas de derecho en los Estados Unidos o, de acuerdo a su experiencia, en otros lugares en el mundo? Escuchar la otra visión, escuchar esto que nosotros hoy tuvimos la posibilidad de escuchar aquí, o cuando leemos Remix o The Future of Culture o Code 2.0. Gracias.
Yeah, it's a great question. Oh, you don't have a headphone. I'm sorry. Sure. So the question is focused on how legal education might be reformed, and what's the strategy for reforming legal education so that lawyers in countries like Argentina have a broader conception of what copyright law is about. And then this particular application in the context of America. I think the first step is really a very academic step. It's to get academics in countries around the world to recognize how the role of copyright law has been changed because of technology. Now, this is a scientific fact. It's not a political argument, right? In the 19th and 20th century, the function of copyright law was to create incentives for creators. But in the digital age, that copyright law overly stifles the opportunity of people to access information. It didn't stifle them in the 19th and 20th century. You know, as my colleague Jessica Lippman describes, you know, in the beginning of the 19th century, most people could go through their whole life never once triggering copyright law, because copyright law was regulating things like printing presses or music companies or these businesses that were engaging in cultural production. And when somebody read a book, they didn't trigger copyright law. And when they gave a book to their friend, they didn't trigger copyright law. So ordinary citizens were not being regulated. But when you move to the digital age, if you have a system of copyright which gets triggered by the production of a, quote, copy, then every one of us triggers copyright law every time we turn our computer on. We are constantly triggering copyright law. And nobody in the regime of intellectual property scholarship ever intended that change to happen. It was solely produced by a change in technology. So the first step is for academics to step back and say, wait, this is not what we planned, what anybody planned, what the system planned. It didn't, nobody, well, not since copyright law was used by censors to censor people from saying what they wanted to say. Not modern copyright law. Modern copyright was not created to regulate every single human who uses digital technology. It's not its purpose. So that's the first step. And that then encourages people to begin to think about, well, how do you update copyright law to make it make sense in the digital context? And that should encourage a debate among scholars about what's the right way to do that. Now, in the United States, one great part of the American system is judges give most of their work to law clerks, and law clerks are basically smart law students in their first or second year out of law school. So that means judges have a very reliable and automatic process for learning what the latest understanding of things is, because the people writing the opinions are basically kids, all the way to the Supreme Court. It's quite astonishing, but that's the way the system works. But this means that the system is actually capable of learning and adjusting to these things much more quickly than in a more traditional system where there isn't that kind of input. So I think in the United States right now, whereas 10 years ago courts were completely unreceptive to these arguments, in the United States right now, courts are increasingly very receptive to these arguments. I mean, we're winning the battle in the courts because the courts are basically coming to understand why there's something has changed here that they need to take account of. And I think that's the dialogue. And then the final thing, maybe the most important thing, is businesses increasingly are looking for lawyers who understand something other than the most restrictive kind of copyright. You know, the most important new businesses are businesses that depend upon people being able to share their creative work. And they're not hiring the lawyers who are really good at suing every single downloader. They're hiring the lawyers who understand how licenses like Creative Commons might make it possible for the business to do stuff that they otherwise wouldn't do. So if you're not training your law students to at least understand that, you're not doing a good job in training law students.
Ana.
Sí, mi nombre es Ana San Llorenti, yo soy directora de la Biblioteca de la Facultad de Ciencias Exactas de la Universidad de Buenos Aires. También soy miembro de la subcomisión de propiedad intelectual de la Asociación de Bibliotecarios. En realidad quería referirme a el aspecto que se estuvo hablando del conocimiento académico, la producción del conocimiento académico, por algo que se dijo por allá. Primero quería comentarle que probablemente lo sepa, pero que en Argentina hay un proyecto de ley que tiene media sanción de la Cámara de Diputados respecto de poner la obligación de que todo el conocimiento producido en todo el sistema de ciencia y tecnología, tanto las universidades como otras instituciones de investigación científica, que sean financiadas con fondos públicos, va a establecer la obligatoriedad de depositar esas obras en acceso abierto en repositorios institucionales. Y bueno, en ese sentido le quería preguntar que si usted tiene relación con representantes, referentes del movimiento de acceso abierto a nivel internacional. ¿Y qué tipo de vínculo hay? Si hay vínculos entre Creative Commons y los principales líderes del movimiento de acceso abierto.
Yeah, so again, the person over here, Cable, you have to raise your hand now. Cable Green, sitting over here, is the core person inside of Creative Commons who's been facilitating that conversation. And we've been having that fight in the United States as well, but we haven't been as successful. So in the United States, there was a push by the government, people in the government, to say government-funded research must be freely accessible. Most people think that's pretty obvious. Like, why should we pay for the research twice? Once to get the research, and then the second time to be able to read it. Why not just require that it's freely accessible from the beginning? But the lobbyists then succeeded in getting that rule changed to be that we at least have to offer a free download of the article, but the article is not freely licensed, or the information isn't necessarily freely licensed, so you can't actually make free use of it. You're just allowed to get a free copy of it. Now that type of compromise makes no sense of the original principle, which is if it's government funded, it ought to be freely available. And I think that if we had other countries around the world that take the lead in the more pure instantiation of that principle, it helps embarrass countries like the United States into doing the right thing. So I think the way to facilitate that is that countries begin to work together to push it. And if Latin America pushed it in every single Latin American country, and then move to North America, that would be really helpful. Move to Europe with the same fight where the same issue is happening, that would be extremely helpful, because it's the sort of issue which nobody in good faith can disagree with. I mean, if you work for Reed Elsevier, maybe you can disagree with it in good faith, but it's because you have a different motive from the motive of somebody who's just asking the question, what makes sense for the spread of knowledge and to keep the costs of governments as low as they possibly can be? What makes sense is that government-funded research should be freely available.
Última pregunta ya en el fondo.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Lessig, for sharing your ideas with us. I deeply believe that everybody in this room will agree, including both of us, that using the state coercion to sustain a private monopoly is justifiable if and only if the social wealth produced by that kind of monopolies exceeds largely the social pains caused by such a monopoly. So, in this order, when you advocate for copyright reform, are you implying that copyright law is necessary?
So first, I completely agree with you. And I was sucked into this field because it just seemed so easy in some contexts to demonstrate why copyright law violated that principle. So for example, my first activist step was in challenging what was called the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act, sometimes known as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, which extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years in the United States. And the obvious point that an economist would say is that whereas copyright law might make sense to create incentives prospectively, incentives are only prospective. You can't retroactively increase incentives. So not even the United States Congress can get George Gershwin to produce anything more. So it could not make sense to extend the term of an existing copyright. And when we challenged that law in the United States Supreme Court, we had a brief signed by 13 economists, including 5 Nobel Prize winners, including the libertarian Milton Friedman, who said he would only sign the brief if the word no-brainer was somewhere in the brief. So obvious was it that you couldn't advance the public good by extending the term of existing copyrights. But the court, 7-2, said Congress was allowed to be crazy if they wanted. You're right. I think there's a lot of progress we can make. But the question you're asking is whether I think that copyright law could ever bear the burden of demonstrating that its restriction was justified because of a public good. And my belief is it could. Not in a lot of places, perhaps. Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court was a professor at Harvard before he became a judge. His tenure piece, his piece that got him tenure at the Harvard Law School, was a piece basically arguing that the vast majority of academic works needed no copyright in order to create an incentive to be produced. There was a small corner where you did need copyright, but it was only a small corner. And so I would love that to be the question. Where do we need copyright law? And I think there are certain places you do need copyright law. So I love terrible Hollywood movies. I just love them. I can't resist them. You're not going to be able to produce a $10 million blockbuster movie if the very first moment you release it, it's freely, you can't control anything about its exception. Now you might say good. Certain people do say good. No more Hollywood movies. That would be fantastic. And there's a very strong and principled anti-copyright or copyright abolitionist movement that says, you can't justify oppression because of the wealth it produces, just like you can't justify slavery because it made Southerners rich. You can't justify restriction on access to knowledge because it makes Hollywood movies possible. It's a compelling argument. I just don't yet buy it. So I'm happy to frame it as, when in my early work on this, I said, let's have a principle. There should be no copyright or there should be no restriction unless you can make a plausible case that the benefits outweigh the cost. And even that minimal principle would carve away a huge chunk of regulation, deregulate a huge chunk. But I guess I'm convinced that there would still be a corner where I could meet that burden, and I'm happy to leave it open to see whether that burden could be met.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Vamos a pedir disculpas a quienes no pudieron preguntar, pero vamos a tener que cerrar aquí. En nombre de Creative Commons Argentina y las instituciones afiliadas a Creative Commons aquí en el país, que somos la Fundación Vía Libre y la Asociación Civil Wikimedia Argentina, queríamos agradecer al profesor Lessig por esta fantástica jornada, a la Facultad de Derecho por habernos hospedado aquí, por tener la voluntad de abrir este debate que creo con Eduardo que hace falta dar justamente en esta casa, y a todos ustedes por habernos acompañado hoy. Mañana tenemos el último día de actividades en la Cumbre Global de Creative Commons. Para quienes de ustedes no estén participando de la cumbre, es un evento abierto, pueden pasar mañana por el Centro Cultural General San Martín y acompañarnos al menos en este último día. La participación es gratuita, los registraremos cuando lleguen y es un placer dar continuidad a este debate que aquí en Argentina tiene todavía una tarea pendiente y tiene mucho por hacer, así que le agradecemos al profesor Lessig y a todos ustedes por esta jornada. Muchas gracias.